Sri Ramana Paravidyopanishad, the supreme science of the self as taught by Sri Ramana. Devotion is taught as being of two kinds, according to the degree of ripeness of the devotee. In the beginning, it is devotion like that of the baby monkey, and afterwards, devotion like that of the kitten. The baby monkey keeps hold of its mother by its own efforts, whereas the kitten makes no effort but relies entirely on the mother cat. The unripe devotee is like the former, and the ripe one is like the latter. The former has his egoism rampant. The egoism of the latter is greatly subdued, and hence he is the recipient of more abundant grace and reaches the goal much sooner. After practicing devotion like that of the baby monkey through a great many lives, in the end, when his egoism is greatly reduced, he practices devotion like the kitten. The devotion that is like the kitten's is the same as taking refuge at the feet of God and surrendering to Him. This devotion, becoming further purified by the refinement of the mind, becomes equal to right awareness in course of time. There is the saying of the Most Holy One that real surrender is that which is made by he who knows the truth of himself by the quest of the self. Self-surrender is real and effective to the extent that the ego sense is attenuated. Hence, so long as the ego survives, self-surrender is imperfect and incomplete. It becomes complete and fruitful only when the ego dies once for all, never to revive. Devotion is also of two kinds, one with a sense of separateness and the other with a sense of non-difference. The former is prescribed for the unrefined, the latter is excellent for the well-refined ones. The sense of difference detracts from the quality of devotion. He who is convinced that differences are not true is alone capable of the real surrender of himself. Hence, his devotion is superior. But, as is shown next, devotion with a sense of difference is not to be despised. If one considering him who is only the self as other than oneself worships him in a form and by a name, then in course of time, through the clarification of his intellect, he surely reaches the supreme state. There is no doubt about this. Ascribing a form and a name to God is unavoidable for those who, being unable to take to the direct path, nevertheless want deliverance and wish to worship God to win His grace. The ignorance and narrowness of those followers of religions that condemn the use of images in divine worship was well exposed by Bhagavan in a talk with some Muslims, which is reported in Maha Yoga, and in talks with Sri Ramana Maharshi. The gist of Bhagavan's reply to the Muslims was that one who thinks himself to be a form, a mortal body, while really being really formless and nameless, has no right to raise this question. During the state of ignorance, it is permissible for a sincere devotee to regard God as having a form and a name, and to use images or symbols to facilitate worship. There is another saying of Bhagavan, which is given in the next verse. If a man adores God, who is nameless and formless, he will be liberated from the bondage due to names and forms. Such is the teaching of Sri Ramana. The man who, being endowed with the divine temperament, meditates with devotion on God with a form, will attain that same state of deliverance that one attains by meditating on Him as formless. One may adore that one being by name and in any form as one likes. Among forms of the Supreme One, the Wise One, whose mind is pure, will not see any superiority or inferiority. Thus, true Catholicity is the distinguishing feature of the teaching of Vedanta. Catholicity consists not in claiming that all people should give up their own faiths and embrace one's own, but in recognizing that all religions are paths to God. The Advaitins are expected to understand this. Then, the dictum of the great poet Kalidasa on this point is quoted. There is only one God form, but it becomes divided into three, and common to all, the three is superiority and inferiority by turns. Among them, there is no real superiority nor inferiority, but superiority or inferiority is allowed to be ascribed to them by devotees to suit their needs. They are all equally forms of formless Brahman, the real self. These forms disappear when the real self is experienced as it really is. Which of all available forms is the best is the next question, which is answered next. Of all the forms of God, the best is the sage who does not consider himself as other than the self. Indeed, the sage who is the Guru is the second of the three forms of divine grace. Bhagavan Sri Krishna himself says in the Gita, I myself am the sage. Therefore, to know this truth of him, as stated in the sacred lore, one should regard the sage as not different from God. Also, there is the text of the Upanishads that one who wants deliverance must worship the knower of the self. If he thinks of him, the sage, who is the Guru, as other than God, that thought will obstruct his path. One of the prominent defects of devotees who regard God as other than the self is next noticed. Those devotees who worship God as not the self are wanting in Catholicity. In the case of a few of them, this defect ceases after a long time by clarification of the intellect. Narrowness of mind is a serious defect, and till it is overcome, the aspirant will not reach his goal. The next topic is God vision, on which some ignorance prevails. The devotee yearns to see the form of God as conceived by himself. Sometimes he may even see that very form, but this vision is transitory and hence unreal. The absurdity of this desire is now shown up. Being himself that very supreme being, but regarding him as other than the self through ignorance, he strives through devotion to obtain a vision of him. Is there anything more surprising than this? How can the seeing of a form of the formless one be a true vision? And how can the vision as not self of him that is the self be a true vision? Bhagavan unties this riddle with ease. All form is mental, and hence the form of the spectacle is inside the spectator. It is the truth of the seer that should be sought, since that is the truth of the Supreme Being. The unreality of these visions is declared next. The man who by the practice of devotion sees God as someone other than himself sees only a mental form. Such is the utterance of the Most Holy One. What then is the reality of God? That which remains over on the annihilation of the would-be seer by the quest for the truth of the seer is itself the truth of the self and also the truth of the Supreme Being. Here, the quest of the self, the direct path taught by Bhagavan, is referred to. The real vision is the same. That state in which the mind, called the soul, is swallowed up and has become one with him, is itself both the true vision of the self and the right vision of God. So says the Holy Guru Sri Ramana. The next question is about how to meditate on God. Revelation prescribes that the aspirant should meditate on him as one's own real self. The revelation styles as beasts those who meditate on him as not the self. Bhagavan Vasishta has said that he who worships God as not self, turning away from the real God, who is the self, is like one who goes about seeking a precious stone, throwing away the gem named Kaustubha already in his hand. This is a quotation from the Yoga Vasishtam. The same subject is dealt with from another point of view. Since the Most Holy One has shown that the original sin spoken of by the Christians is just the sense of I am the body, the sense of being separate from God, which is the outcome of this sin, is itself only sinful. The completeness, allness of the Supreme Being, asserted by revelation, becomes true only by his being the self. The deluded ones are just denying this completeness of his by their notion of being separate from themselves. But devotion, practiced without a sense of difference, is the way of accepting this completeness of God. And Bhagwan, our Guru, says that this devotion is most excellent and highly purifying for the aspirant for deliverance. Bhagwan also shows that devotion with sense of difference does not lead to the goal. Also, the Most Holy One has shown that like the man who pursues darkness, light in hand, the devotee who meditates on God as separate does not reach God, so long as he has this false notion. The light in the hand is the real self, and the darkness is the non-existent, separate God. This is said by Bhagwan in the Arunachala Ashtakam. The superior devotion, on the other hand, leads to the goal, which is the egoless state. Since the better devotee approaches God as the self, knowing that the notion of difference due to the ego is false, for this aspirant for deliverance, the annihilation of the ego will be accomplished quickly. In the case of him who adores God as non-self, the surrender of himself is a sham, just like the gift of a coconut to a guest is a sham in the Chola region. The analogy given here is the custom of placing a coconut on a plate, just for form's sake, without intending to give it. Another consequence of the sense of difference is next noted. When the Supreme Being is reduced to the status of non-self, the result is that he is not the most beloved of all. For according to both revelation and the common experience of all creatures, the self is the dearest of all. The concluding verse of the teaching in the Gita is a riddle. How Bhagavan, our master, solved this riddle is shown next. Bhagavan, our Guru, declared the secret of the correct meaning of the last verse of the Gita in the following way. One should make surrender of oneself to the Supreme One by giving up the attributes falsely ascribed to the real self, namely, that one is a soul, and so on. The word dharma in that verse of the Gita must not be taken as meaning righteous action, but as meaning status or quality. Thus interpreted, the verse makes good sense, not otherwise. This brings us to the topic of self-surrender, which is now explained. What is called surrender of oneself to God is the final consummation of the practice of devotion. This can be achieved by the purified mind when the might of the ego is greatly reduced. Just as a small magnet becomes united to a big one by the juxtaposition of the opposite poles, so the finite soul becomes one with the Supreme Being by the conjunction of its head with his feet. This simile of the magnet serving to bring out the need of perfect humility of the devotee. If the ego is rampant, there can be no self-surrender. How the one that has surrendered himself to God must get through life until he attains perfect egolessness is described next. The self-surrender is truly made by him who always has the feeling, let all things happen according to your will. In all respects, I am bound to you. That is, after self-surrender, he must resign himself to the divine will without any reservations. He that has surrendered himself will be at peace, remembering that he, God, is the bearer of the world's burden. The one that bears the burden himself will be ridiculous, like the figure on the temple tower, appearing to bear the tower on its own shoulders. As one traveling in a carriage puts down his luggage in the carriage itself and completes his journey, so should he resign his own samsaric burden to God and complete his life in the world. Those who take on themselves the task of reforming the world or of alleviating the sufferings of others are dealt with next. The wise one should resign to God his cares concerning the good of the world, just as he resigns to him his cares about his own body and family. The ripe devotee must pass his time patiently, enduring whatever happens to him, whether pleasant or unpleasant, or otherwise, without yielding to sorrow or joy, with his heart absorbed in him. When the ego dies, having been swallowed by divine grace, the devotee's self-surrender becomes true and complete. This has been said in the language of the intellect, but the actual truth of this consummation transcends the intellect and is hence not easy to convey in words. Indeed, the notion of self-surrender is absorbed from the standpoint of the absolute truth, as would be the offering to Ganesha of a portion taken from an image of Ganesha made of jaggery. So is the surrender of one's self to God, since there is no self apart from Him. Since the self is the Supreme Being Himself, by whom, how, and to whom is the surrender to be made? True self-surrender is only the extinction of the ego, by which the sense of being different from Him arises. If you desire to give yourself to God, then first seek out and know yourself. The gift of oneself to God will be accomplished in this way. So said the Most Holy One. The truth about namaskara, prostration, is the same as self-surrender. This is explained next. The truth of namaskara also is only the perfect giving up of the ego sense, right awareness, self-surrender, and namaskara. All these three are one and the same. Thus, it is shown that God does not become an object of vision, neither does He become an object of knowledge. As God does not become an object of vision, neither does He become an object of knowledge. Since He transcends the mind will know Him, if at all, only wrongly. Since the real self, which is consciousness, is the same as God, and since there is no consciousness apart from Him, it follows that there is no one to know Him other than He, nor does He become an object of knowledge. The real self is the eternal subject, and hence He can never become an object, says Bhagavan. The source of the light of consciousness that exists in the mind is just the real self. Hence, apart from Him, there is no such thing as mind existing as something real. Like the sun, the consciousness that is the self shines in the heart by its own light. By its light, the mind, which by itself is insentient, appears as sentient, like the moon. Since mind consciousness is not the true nature of the mind. It goes into latency in deep sleep. But the real self never goes into latency, since consciousness is its very nature. But the mind has the power of veiling the self. The mind always veils for itself the real nature of the self, both in dream and in waking, becoming latent in deep sleep and wholly extinguished in the supreme state. How can it ever know him who is the sole reality? Om Namo Bhagavate Sri Arunachal Ramanaya.